Hola, Startup Grind. How are you doing? Yeah. I cannot see anybody. I've been told that there's a lot of people here, but I cannot hear you. How are you doing? Ow. Good. So I'm Alex. I'm director of Startup Grind Barcelona. I feel very honored to introduce you to Dustin Moskovitz. Who has ever heard of Dustin Moskovitz? Yeah. He did a terrific job in that Facebook movie, didn't he? He's my favorite actor. Just kidding. Well, Dustin, amongst other things, he created Facebook back in the day. That allowed him to become the youngest self-made billionaire according to Forbes. But in 2008, he left to create Asana. Asana is a platform that allows teams to track their work with integrations with other collaboration software. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dustin Moskovitz and also to Katie Brenner, who will be interviewing him in this fireside chat. Let's give it up for them.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to be here, and I'm really honored to interview Dustin. He and I had a very fun preliminary chat, and I think it's going to be a good conversation today.
Absolutely.
So I just want to dive right in. Dustin, a little bit ago, you wrote an essay on work-life balance, and in it, you described your time at Facebook, which was such a rocket ship. It's, I think, by every objective measure, an extremely successful company, and you had a great experience there. So I'm curious about how work-life balance could have made that experience better or could have improved on the company for its employees when things were going well in so many ways.
Sure, yeah, this is definitely a topic I'm really passionate about. So you're referring to a post I wrote on Medium a couple months ago. There's also a sort of great accompanying post on the Asana blog that's more of sort of like a how-to for work-life balance for your company. Yeah, the genesis for this is just, when I started working in the Valley, I feel like, I sort of succumbed to the pressure that I think a lot of entrepreneurs feel, a lot of employees feel, to just work extremely hard, to feel, the time pressure and feel like that translates to an urgent need to just keep driving, keep grinding, if you will. I think there's also sort of a culture almost of like one-upsmanship, especially for people in their early 20s of how many hours in a row have you been up lately to get this project done, things like that. And it just, so I sort of fell into that and, kind of burnt myself out in a lot of phases. And, I think a lot of people look back at that and say, oh, that's what you needed to do. That's what it takes. I think I even heard one of the interviewers saying something like this. That's what it takes to be successful. But I actually think we were successful kind of in spite of it, because looking back, I can see how it affected a lot of my interactions. It affected my focus, affected my ability to make good decisions. So now I approach Asana very differently, and the advice I give to entrepreneurs is very different of you have to manage this really carefully. You have to manage your energy, and you can optimize it in ways that don't just mean super long hours and never taking vacations and things like that. It's really about, striking the balance, taking time to recharge, taking time to reflect and reground, and that's really how you end up operating optimally. And it's just counterintuitive to a lot of people who think, no, the marginal hour will mean one more hour of work. But I just, I think there's a lot of research, there's a lot of experiences other people have told me about, my own experience, that just lead me to think, no, that's sort of, that's just misleading people and taking them in the wrong direction.
Sure, I think that's great. And I'm very curious, you say you give very different kinds of advice now. Is there maybe one key piece of advice or one thing that you often tell people that they should think about in terms of keeping work-life balance? It's really important, maybe just for themselves, for their own personal health, and how that will improve their ability to work.
Yeah, so, one thing that I think is really many pieces of advice, but just think of work-life balance as fractal, right? You've got to take breaks during the day, you've got to go around, you've got to take a walk every once in a while, you've got to actually take your nights and unplug from work and not just be emailing up until you fall asleep. You should take your weekends, you should take actual vacations during the year, and even on even longer time arcs than that, I really encourage people to take sabbaticals, and we've engineered that into the the Asana benefits. You really just have to think about the sort of times to recharge that match the lengths of time you're focusing.
Got it. The idea of workaholism is so important to so many people in the Valley. So even if you're personally setting a good example, it might not always translate. I'm curious about what Asana is doing as an organization to build in measures to preserve a culture of mindfulness as, like many startups, you're growing very, very fast.
Sure. Oh man, I could talk for hours on that. Again, I'll just point out, we write a lot about this. I've actually written an entire post about mindfulness specifically. But the sort of meta answer, ironically, is to be mindful and to think about it, take time for it, and be intentional. And that has manifested in a bunch of different ways. So we similarly at Asana have sort of like fractal periods of rest and focus. So people who are familiar with agile software development know about sprints and off sprints. That's one form of it. We also do it in these longer cycles called episodes that are about 4 months long, and we take a full week of time in between those to do planning and reflection and kind of recharge. It's actually, we call that Roadmap Week. It's actually happening at Asana right this minute. And yeah, just, we have to really encourage employees, again, to, take sabbaticals, take vacations. We may be one of the only cultures where your manager will say, like, hey, you haven't taken a vacation lately, like, kind of push you out the door a little bit.
Resumes are going to come flying in after
Yeah.
this, just so you know.
But you have to keep it in balance. You still have to work hard when you're working, and we work extremely hard, but, you can go in either direction.
Sure. And I'm curious, you mentioned Roadmap Week, where you plan and reflect. Could you talk about some of the things that get done during Roadmap Week that maybe allow Asana to grow without as many pain points as I think a lot of startups experience?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, a lot of companies do like quarterly planning. So in some ways, it's very similar to that in terms of each of our like the marketing team, the PR team, each of the product development teams, they're all meeting to kind of plan their next chunk of work. But in addition, we're reflecting it sort of more abstract ways. So for example, there will be a committee about the Asana values, and sometimes we'll kind of like refine what those are. Sometimes we'll just explain them a little better. We'll try and find opportunities to bring them into some of our practices. There'll be a committee on like internal communication, sort of like reflecting on whether the cadence of our all hands and the way we're using them are useful. Just sort of like looking for places where there may start to be some cracks, or the seams are fraying a bit, and trying to plan ahead. So I think in a lot of companies, a lot of problems don't get addressed until like literally the wheels are falling off the bus, and you like have to address it, or the whole company is going to blow up. And in Asana, we use Roadmap Week to be a point where we're saying, okay, what's starting to be a problem? Let's try and get out ahead of it. And then it's a lot easier to address, because then you can just do more minor course corrections that can help you get to that next scale of growth.
Sure. So before I got here today, I interviewed a bunch of entrepreneurs just to ask them what they thought of mindful work. And one question that came up again and again was personnel issues. They said, when you're hiring at a startup and things are moving fast, sometimes you can't deal, or you feel that you can't deal with someone you've hired who's not working out, or somewhere there's a communication breakdown, and they don't know how to deal with that situation. That's the situation that came up specifically again and again. How do you deal with that situation? A talented person, but nobody has the time or the wherewithal to really understand the problem. How would that work out at Asana? How would that be dealt with in a more mindful way?
And you're saying that the problem is with the person? They're
right.
not
Maybe there's an engineer who people aren't getting along with, or there's hard to manage the person. Very talented,
Sure.
But we're growing fast. Why don't we just ignore it and figure it out later and hope that he or she just kind of comes along?
Okay. Well, I'll just point out, to me, there's sort of a clear logical fallacy there of like, they are dealing with that. There is a cost to a person like that in your organization of demotivating other people, causing friction, causing politics. So you can ignore it, and you may think that's saving you time, but I would argue it's probably going to be more costly even in the short run. So I think the Asana attitude would just be, value that fact, and respect it from a rational basis, and invest the time. So we'll do that in a couple ways. One, when you come into the company, we're going to onboard you onto these types of values. We'll take you through some workshops that'll help you just understand how to identify your internal states, help you talk in a more mindful way, and that'll set people up for success as they begin in the organization and give everyone kind of a common language. We also have coaches available for people who can work on these kind of interpersonal issues, whether it's a coach for the person who's maybe causing this friction, or for the people around them, so that they can figure out how to interact with that person better and form productive relationships. And yeah, just I think really just engage with the problem and treat it as something worth working on. I think the attitude for a lot of startups is like, oh, 95% of our work is just like the product and the finances, and like everything else doesn't matter. And I think that's can be true if your company is just doing so well that you can like constantly rehire people when they're leaving, and like you don't have to worry about the sort of long run. But most companies like aren't like that. You need to be able to survive downturns. You need to be able to survive some turnover, and that's when it's really worth investing in your culture and building a solid foundation for the long run.
Great. Since you mentioned the downturn, I want to address that too. It's another thing that's sort of come up in conversations I've had.
Yep.
For some people, liquidity is getting hard to come by. People are trying to buckle down and figure out how to save money, in some cases.
Sure.
So where does culture fit into that? It feels in some ways like a secondary problem. Like, we just need to get this company going, and we just need to grow. These are sort of very immediate issues. So why does good culture help in a time of a downturn, or when things slow down or things get rough?
Yeah, again, I would just say when you're not in a downturn, you can kind of get away with a lot. But then when these sort of corrections happen, those problems, small problems, become very big problems. And there's been a lot of news lately about companies where they were doing extremely well financially, they were getting great valuations, and then all of a sudden, they weren't hitting their growth numbers, they're a little too optimistic about their model, and all of a sudden they lose like half their executives, or maybe you need to have the board change over the CEO. It's happened recently, and that's the consequence, I think, of not investing in culture. And you kind of have to, in some cases it can be very, very costly, and you kind of get set back 6 months or a year in your progress, because then you really have to address those things.
Sure. And management is such a big topic here in the Valley, and it's probably why this room's really full right now. People really care about management. So there are a lot of, I won't call them fads, but really extreme responses to traditional management, including like flat structures where there's no manager, including very, very almost militaristic structures that you see in some places. And it seems like you're somewhere in the middle here. So I'm wondering, how did your experiences at Facebook, or your co-founder's experiences at Google, sort of shape what Asana has become? What did you take from those companies that really worked, and what did you feel that you needed to augment?
Sure. So I'll just say, when we started Asana, we really just tried to be, thoughtful and study a bunch of different cultures. So we relied a lot on our own experiences, but also just tried to talk to people at other companies. A bunch of things came up. Certainly with respect to management, I think you hear sort of, two different stories that lead to these two different extremes. One is, if somebody comes from a culture that's very tops down and very sort of militaristic, as you said, they can feel very constrained, like they don't have the autonomy and decision-making authority they need to do their job well. They feel very at the effect of their bosses. And then on the other hand, if you come from a culture that's totally flat, doesn't have managers, you can feel unsupported. And so I know a bunch of people who have been kind of washed out of those cultures, especially if you're inexperienced and you're really hoping to learn learn from strong mentors. Not having a manager can be like really scary, and can just mean that you spend a lot of time kind of pounding your head on the desk and not making progress because you don't have that guidance. So Asana's solution is really meant to be a balance. And so we have what we call, basically emphasize distributed responsibility. So we're trying to push decision-making to the edges as much as possible. But we also have what on paper looks like a very traditional org chart. We're very conscious about the ratio of employees to managers, because I think about 6 to 8 is about right. If you're a new manager, you should have fewer. If you're a very experienced manager, maybe you can stretch to 10. But after that, you just do a poor job supporting your people. But again, you can kind of add these sort of countermeasures if you are in one of these situations. So if you have a really high employee to manager ratio, you should consider a peer mentorship program or having external coaches. You can supplement that coaching. If you have a very tops-down management structure or hierarchical, you should provide some outlets for people to express creativity. So I think this is part of why Google has 20% time. Hackathons are also very good for this. Basically just having the right composition of these different things where people can feel strongly supported but also have the autonomy they need to do their best work, I think is really the best outcome.
Sure. And you've also brought up, what's good for employees. At some organizations, it's hard for them to thrive because of the structure. Also, I think in the world of startups, we're seeing employees start to become more vocal around certain issues, like compensation, like employee equity, trying to understand more about what's happening to them there. They really, especially because things are starting to slow down a little bit. So when you're on the rocket ship, you kind of don't really care so much about what's going to happen to your equity compensation, because there's a belief that the IPO will take care of it all.
Right.
And as that becomes shakier, people are asking more questions. So it becomes a transparency within a company issue. How transparent do you want to be with your employees about how the company is doing, about how successful it looks like you're going to be, about what the exits will be and how they will impact them? How do you deal with those things at Asana?
Yeah, it's still something I'm learning about and trying to calibrate our own approach. Generally, transparency by default is literally one of our values. We try and just push that as far as we can, and really have good reasons when we're not communicating something. But I've also just really emphasized things that are easy for people to understand. I mean, I think options are just such a foreign subject for the vast majority of employees, that it's already just a steep learning curve to climb. But then you add things like the double liquidation preferences and ratchets and these things that are starting to come up, then we're only even discovering them as companies IPO, and it's just like total losing game for employees. So I've just been very careful not to allow those things into the structure of Asana in the first place, so that at least once you have the details, you're able to interpret them in an apples-to-apples way with other companies. But yeah, I think it's just like kind of a really unfair situation for employees in general. Once people are sort of 10, 15 years into their career, they develop more of a mastery around these subjects and ask smarter questions, and I think have more of a bias towards the companies that are going to be steady and consistent than the ones that claim to be rocket ships and just go for highest possible valuation at all costs and these things. I think it's easy when it's your first 5 years in the valley, maybe you haven't lived through one of these corrections before or seen or understand why people are so skeptical, but anybody who's been here for 10 years has, and they get a sense of this, and they're just, they have a huge advantage versus everyone else.
And are you seeing the hiring pool change, the sorts of candidates come through your door change? Are you seeing more or less, or are people more concerned now about culture as they look for jobs?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, I think a lot of startups are hiring people straight out of school, and I think they kind of don't know what they don't know. But for people who Asana is their second or their third job, it's very top of mind. And there's almost a sort of cynicism or disbelief of like, oh, I hear stories of like your culture is really great, but it can't actually be like that, because they just know all of their friends work in these other cultures that are more familiar. So yeah, I think we tend to see people who are seeking that later in their careers.
Got it, sure. I'm very curious, you had mentioned earlier that you'd gone out and you'd spoken to a lot of different people about their company cultures and how they built culture. In those conversations, were there figures that emerged that you just really admire and that you look to for advice about whether it's running a company, how to create great culture, how to keep employees motivated and happy at the same time? Who are those figures that emerged for you?
Yeah, I think the one that I probably lean on the most is actually Sam Altman. He hasn't run a company himself for a while, but obviously he interacts with a lot of companies through YC. And his blog is just really great in sort of approaching the employee point of view on things like options and exercise windows and all of these things. So I've just really respected a lot of what he has to say, and almost on a weekly or monthly basis, and like asking him about a particular question, like how would you approach this? Other people I would point to, so Adam D'Angelo, who's on the Asana board, Patrick Collison, and then of course I talk to Zuck quite a bit still, and really try and take some of the best lessons from Facebook.
So you guys are still friends?
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
Still speaking up to her?
Yeah, still on speaking terms.
Okay, good to know. And I guess finally, I'm really curious, what are some specific things you're doing to keep your own employees motivated? Because within this culture, some of the things you described feel like very long view thinking, really planning for the future, really seeing a distant picture. How are you keeping people motivated to still complete tasks that need to be done, sometimes urgently now? How are you balancing long and near-term goals?
Yeah, I mean, well, so for one thing, we just like talk about it literally like that. It's part of the internal master strategy to be intentional about balancing short run and long run. And I think there's a couple things I would emphasize. So one is just making sure there's real clarity of plan, purpose, and responsibility. So I think people get especially demotivated when they're unsure what they're supposed to be doing versus what their teammates supposed to be doing. That's when you get into turf battles. They get demotivated when it's unclear how this particular task levels up to the company mission. So my co-founder Dustin is particularly good at when people get into that state, he'll sit down with them and be like, okay, you're typing up this code review. What's that in service of in terms of a larger project, and just walk them all the way up the chain. And you have to kind of checkpoint your progress. So episodes are also a good structure for that. Roadmap week is both a time to plan for the future and also ground in what we just accomplished and evaluate how we did with our sort of near-term goals and set the ones for the future. So yeah, you have to talk both about the long run and also, again, it's fractal. You have to talk about what are we doing in the next year, what are we doing in the next 4 months, what are we doing in the next sprint, what are we doing today.
Mm-hmm. What are the signs that you look for that show you that an employee is not motivated, a danger sign that you can see and maybe somehow intervene before it becomes a problem?
Well, again, I think if you have these strong support networks with managers who actually have time to engage with their reports every couple of weeks, it's pretty obvious. I think you have to be kind of negligent to have someone demotivated for an extended period of time and not be able to notice it.
Got it. So, this has been really great, and I guess to sum up, it's really about talking to people all along the way and great communication, open lines of communication, and really conscientious planning around how people are treating one another at the company.
Exactly.
This is fantastic. Dustin, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great. Success.